Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. In this entry, we'll be taking a look at the characters of the 2013 film Prisoners. Now, in case you haven't seen this film, I'd highly recommend you close this out and check out the film first, as there will be a spoiler element that might affect your first viewing of it. But for those of you still here, let's continue. A film like Prisoners serves as a reminder that we live in a very wicked world, and that oftentimes the cycle of trauma is regrettably passed on, with every main character in the film being a prisoner of sorts, some more literal than others. In this video, we'll be taking a look at some of the characters. That of the protagonist, Keller Dover, who himself is guilty of some crimes of his own, with his extreme methods in recovering his kidnapped daughter. Then we have the priest, who, like Keller, became an instrument of vigilante justice. And finally, Holly and Leo Jones, both of whom took part in the serial kidnapping and murder of 16 children out of a misguided concept of God. Starting off with Keller first, at initial impression, he comes off as well-mannered, no-nonsense, and disciplined, virtuous traits which he also tries to replicate in his family. Keller's central trait is his spirituality, being a devout man often quoting the Lord's Prayer. This faith in God, however, is put to the ultimate test when his daughter is kidnapped, and now the religious Keller is unable to complete that same prayer, being stuck at the line where we seek forgiveness as we forgive others who have trespassed against us. After having reasonable grounds for suspicion, combined with what he perceives to be a lack of competence from the local police, Keller decides to take matters into his own hands and kidnaps Alex Jones, a suspect whom he believes to be responsible for the kidnapping. It would be hard to fully imagine the anguish that Keller is under. We learn that he is a very proactive person, often taking measures to be prepared for the worst-case scenario, most notably his obsession with survivalist gear and preparing for a doomsday scenario. Nothing, however, could prepare him for the ordeal of the potential loss of a child, a situation that likely has a more devastating effect on him when you consider his own past trauma, the tragedy that his father chose to end his own life. Keller is a man who's had his own struggles, another of which is his past battle with alcoholism, a vice which he relapses to as a coping mechanism for the current situation. In the midst of the immense stress, Keller becomes a completely different person. Where once he was gracious enough to always wait to be invited, now he is flying into fits of berserker rage while threatening and inflicting physical harm. To curb the guilt of his actions, he bears the mentality of the worst-case scenario, and Keller himself says this as much when he assumes that his daughter may have been deprived of water for 5 days and on the brink of death. Was Keller wrong to kidnap Alex to torture him for the whereabouts of the children? Yes, but given the urgency of the situation, together with his suspicion of Alex, one can see how he would resort to such drastic measures. Although he himself essentially becomes guilty of becoming a kidnapper, the very crime that plagues him, it comes from a different moral perspective, and it's in response to the inciting incident. Therefore, it would be a mistake to suggest that Keller is equally guilty. If any hypothetical third person were in the position of Keller, they would certainly be just as suspicious of Alex as he was, given that the girls were last seen at his RV, the fact that he attempted to flee when the police confronted him, his dubious statement at the parking lot, combined with the final straw of him singing the exact variant of Jingle Bells that the girls recently sung. Those are too many coincidences to ignore, and it's harder to rationalize clearly when you're drowning in anxiety over the possibility of losing your child. It's been a few days since the disappearance of the girls, and with no ransom note received, you can more readily conclude that the motive behind their abduction is something more sinister. It's a tough crossroads to be at, the figurative example of being in between a rock and a hard place. Either you sit back while the police have no leads on the case, or you step out of the bounds of the law and resort to a legal means before the chances of recovering your child rapidly drop to zero. Given Keller's proactive nature, he opts for the former option, and perhaps he might be more justified in his actions if not for the confounding factor in the equation, namely that Alex is not mentally sound, possessing the intelligence of a 10-year-old. Which begs the question, how much blame can we attribute to Alex for his part in the case? When it comes down to it, he did lie to Detective Loki about not recognizing the girls or about inviting them into his RV. Given that he parked the RV outside the former house of his biological mother, he does have some level of awareness and intelligence. But given the amount of trauma he has experienced, combined with the fragile state of his mind, it's suggestible to say that the answer to the question of blame should not amount to much, as Alex is very much a victim himself whose verbal responses are hindered by his own mental illness and trauma. But in the state of his anger and fear for his daughter, Keller glances over this crucial fact and believes that Alex is faking it. So now Keller has Alex captive and under torture, but he cannot establish an intelligent conversation with him, let alone obtain the location of his daughter. Kidnapping is one offense, but torture brings it to a whole new level. The ordeal that Alex is put through is no trivial matter, being beaten to a bloody pulp before being placed into solitary confinement, all while basic necessities like food, water, and medical care are withheld from him. Yes, Keller did show some restraint, only inflicting pain while within the confines of keeping Alex alive, and it's likely that from a physical standpoint, Alex would eventually recover from his injuries. But it's the mental scarring that presents the bigger challenge, especially for someone whose mental faculties are stunted to begin with. Who knows the amount of further damage done by Keller, especially with solitary confinement, which has been known to have lasting traumatic effects even on mentally sound individuals. So while Keller's capturing of Alex is somewhat understandable, the continued and relentless torture is not. Of course, both are outside the scope of the law and can never be condoned. This further adds to the impossibility of the situation. Keller knows that Alex is somehow involved, and correctly so, but each blow he deals to him only serves to silence him further. Of course, by this point, Alex has to remain his prisoner, as Keller has already broken the law. The issue for him would be to try to get as reduced a prison sentence as possible. Also at this point, it should be said that all that was previously mentioned about Keller's crimes applies in some respect to Franklin and Nancy as well, given that they were his accomplices for a time, but chose to let him continue his barbaric interrogation. The issue that we also must ultimately come to is the question of what is Keller's endgame. If Alex really was the kidnapper and he eventually divulges their location, what then for Keller? He would have saved his daughter's life, but now has to face a prison sentence. The only way to avoid that would be to kill Alex to make him disappear permanently. Given his religious stance, I would assume that kidnapping and torture are the full extent of the measures that Keller is willing to take. When it comes down to it, I feel he would be willing to exchange his freedom and be subject to prison if it means saving his daughter's life. Perhaps the best intermediate solution to begin with would be to not capture Alex, but to simply stalk him for a longer period with the hope of catching him in an incriminating act. Imagine all the trouble that could have been saved if Keller had simply broken into Alex's home and inspected the place for clues. Alex did actually have some knowledge of the location of the girls, just that forcing it out of him was the wrong approach. And while this could never be planned, the kidnapping of Alex did eventually result in the coincidental outcome of finding the girls. Loki would never have gone to Holly's house and found the girls if not for the news of Alex's capture. In the end, while it's never shown on screen, I believe that Keller was rescued from his prison hole. By the conclusion of the film, Loki is more cautious of coincidences, such as the fact that Leo Jones was the same man found in the basement of the priest. While he initially dismisses the sound of the whistle, eventually he hears it again and does a double take, indicating that he knows something is amiss. In the course of the film, we find that Keller isn't the only one to have engaged in vigilante justice. The other individual isn't as prominent in terms of his part in the story, but his actions have perhaps just as much significance. This individual is the priest, who, after hearing a horrifically boastful confession from a serial kidnapper and murderer, decides to take matters into his own hands and kill the criminal. Just like with Keller's situation, this situation has its tough edges. You've heard the gory confessions of a serial killer who has killed 16 children and intends to carry on this wicked spree. Given the context of the confession and his intention to boast about it, you can be pretty sure that he was telling the truth and deliberately abusing the entitlement of confidentiality. But as a priest, under the code of canon law, you are forbidden to break the seal of confession under any circumstance, even if the perpetrator is intending to commit another crime. In fact, United States civil law recognizes the entitlement of a priest to maintain the confidentiality of the confession, no matter what was said. If you do break confidentiality, you would surely face excommunication from the Catholic Church, and on the extreme end, there's also the worst-case scenario of the man being able to escape justice should there be insufficient evidence to convict him, or if the police don't take the claim seriously. The fact that he has committed 16 of these crimes and is now boasting about it implies that he has been adept at covering his tracks. And if that happens, then more victims are going to die. So would their blood be then on your hands? Not only that, your own safety would be also jeopardized, as you most definitely will become his next target. Giving an anonymous tip to the authorities is not really viable unless Leo Jones divulged the identity of his next target. And even then, it would only guarantee the safety of his next target, and not the rest of the other potential victims. Navigating such a case is complex, to say the least. It truly could be said to be a lose-lose situation. The most viable solution would be for the priest to somehow get Leo Jones to admit to his crimes outside of confession, which would then free him to inform the authorities. Given that the priest invited Leo Jones back to his house, there is a possibility that he did attempt this. But I imagine that Leo Jones didn't fall for it, and perhaps the priest, in his frustration from the futility of his actions, combined with his horror at the gruesome crimes committed, saw no better outcome than simply eliminating the man outright. And from the looks of it, it seems that Leo Jones was bound for some time in the basement, and given how inaccessible it was, he was possibly subject to the agony of death by starvation, ironically while his room was blocked by a refrigerator. So Keller is guilty of kidnapping and torture, while the priest is guilty of murder. Both crimes, when viewed in isolation, however, for both their cases they are doing it to save lives. But overall, as to whether the actions of the priest are more or less at fault in comparison to that of Keller's, I truly can't hang my hat on either, but I'd suggest the priest is less at fault. Both are outside the scope of what is socially deemed right, but for the case of the priest, there is far less uncertainty in his situation. And finally, we come to the most chilling and deplorable individual still alive in the film, that of Holly Jones, who carried on her husband's work after his disappearance, leading to the current predicament in the film. Holly is a woman of few words and appears to be a social recluse like her surrogate son, Alex. She comes across as gentle and meek, albeit with some chronic sadness reflected in her constantly furrowed brow, and with an overall look that resembles a smaller version of Mrs. Doubtfire. But this appearance is the height of deception, as Holly is one of the few people we can truly label a monster. As if kidnapping and murdering wasn't enough of a travesty, then you also have the psychological torture that she puts the children through, giving them false hope under the pretense of allowing them to go home once they've finished all the mazes, with the last maze being an unsolvable one. This concept of the unsolvable maze reflects Holly and Leo's own imprisonment and their own trauma, which gives rise to their own fascination with the puzzle. Misery loves company, and no other phrase perfectly sums up the intentions of this depraved couple. Of her own admission, Holly and her husband, Leo, started off drastically different than they are now, being devout followers of their faith, possibly Catholic, as hinted at by Leo Jones going for a confession to a priest. As she recalls, she and her husband were busy doing the good work, handing out pamphlets as they drove around their RV with their son. However, their faith was shaken to its foundations after their son died of cancer, a fate which they blamed God for and became resentful. At its core, the resentment of the Jones couple has its origin in their pride, in their ego, expressed in their misplaced sense of entitlement that somehow God owes it to them to heal their son. Not much needs to be said to elaborate on how diluted this mentality is. I'm sure that Holly and Leo would have witnessed the fact that trouble befalls everyone, even the devout saints of the Bible. However, it's likely that they believe that since they were busy spreading the good work, that it somehow entitles them to a life free of tragedy. You might not be religious, but you don't have to be to imagine coming from their perspective and their fallacy. To believe that an omnipotent, all-powerful God to whom you owe your very existence to and rely on for your next breath could somehow be indebted to you is the height of foolishness, to say the least. An even more ludicrous delusion would be an attempt to wage war on God, an act which the Jones couple used to describe their crimes, seeking to turn other parents like Keller into jaded and destructive demons like themselves. Yes, the death of a child from cancer is an absolute tragedy and is always cause for grief, but stealing the children of others only adds more misery to the situation. Looking at the subdued state of Alex, we can only ask how good of a replacement was he for their son. Probably not much, as the Jones couple likely had to resort to drastic means to break him and keep him compliant, which in turn left him as a non-functioning member of society. While it's far easier said than done, the only reasonable path for the Jones couple would be to try to find some way to move on, whether it's through adopting a child who they can freely be affectionate with instead of keeping it as a prisoner, or finding their life purpose elsewhere in another endeavor. Perhaps it might be good to close with the words of the sermon that Keller pondered on in the early stages of the kidnapping, which by themselves cast condemnation on the religious delusion of the Jones couple. Those words are that trouble and affliction are what we all have reason to expect in this world. Man is brought into trouble, not as man, but as sinful man who is in transgression, man born in sin and therefore born to trouble.